1765, John Wesley preaches his famous sermon on the Scripture way of salvation. I mention that because that's one of the standard ones that we have students study. In 1768, John felt like he needed to make some legal provision for his societies. Very often, justices of the peace would break up meetings saying that they were contrary to the Act of Toleration of 1689 that had provided for the worship of dissenting Protestants. That means Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Quakers, if they followed certain rules. And one of those rules was that they had to register their places of worship. John Wesley didn't think that was necessary for him because he said, we're not dissenters from the Church of England. But sometimes justices of the peace said, well, you're not in an Anglican church or chapel, you're not in a registered dissenting place of worship, so, what are you? But you're not allowed to worship here. John Wesley then developed what he called a model deed for the Methodist Society in 1768, and then each society that had built a preaching house building could take that and use it as their model for registering their chapel. Some people saw that as an act of independence of the Church of England, though in the model deed itself, John Wesley specified that he and the preachers did not dissent from the Church of England in any particular matters of doctrine or practice. A new development came in 1778 when John Wesley built a new chapel for his societies in London. It was built on City Road next to a house that he would build for himself and for the leaders of the societies there. It's built like, I think, the architectural form of a Constantinian basilica, almost square, 2 rows of columns down the middle, an apse, or a semicircular area at the east end of the building, that is the end where the congregation was pointed. It had an altar for the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So John Wesley is no longer following the Anglican rubrics or canons that required him to be in a consecrated space for worship. From that time, he dedicated that chapel on All Saints' Day, November the 1st, 1778, and Methodists have used it ever since that time. It is station number 1, I think, in the British Methodist rotas of their traveling preachers. I was present 200 years later on November the 1st, 1978, when it was rededicated and the Queen herself and Prince Philip were present for that rededication. By the 1770s and the early 1780s, John Wesley was facing the crisis of what to do about his North American societies after the time of the American Revolution. I'm going to talk much more about that in a future lecture, but let me say at this point that in September of 1784, he finally ordained 2 of his preachers. He did not have authority by the Church of England to ordain, but he felt like every presbyter had the inherent right to ordain. And he laid his hands on an Anglican priest, Thomas Cook, and consecrated him to serve as superintendent of the Methodists in North America, with the authority to ordain others, which is the authority that Anglican bishops had traditionally held. They went off to North America. We'll catch up with them later. The point I want to make, though, is that increasingly Methodists in England were using the services that John Wesley had designed for North America. And eventually he would ordain ministers for Scotland and then for England, so that by the time he died, Methodists in England had their own ordained ministers. They had their own version of the prayer book. They were celebrating baptism and the Lord's Supper at the same time as Anglican parish churches down the street. Frank Baker said that the Methodists, by the time John Wesley died, were de facto a separate church, even if they were not de jure, that is to say, even if they were not legally a separate church at that time, they had become de facto a separate church. Charles Wesley died in 1788. John was very much broken up over his brother's death. John, in 1791, preached, I think he preached his last sermon actually late in the year 1790. On February the 24th, he wrote a letter to a member of Parliament, William Wilberforce. It is the last letter that we have from John Wesley, encouraging Wilberforce's efforts to end the slave trade. You may know that Wilberforce would eventually prevail in that, and within a few hours of his death in 1830, Wilberforce would learn that his great life's work had succeeded, and Parliament had agreed to abolish the institution of slavery throughout all of the British possessions. That was John Wesley's last letter, though. Within 6 days, he died on March the 2nd, 1791. According to the provisions of his will, his coffin had been carried to its resting place by 6 paupers who were paid for their services. And the Methodists were left then to carry on in his absence. We're going to have a lot more to say now about his connectionalism, his theology, and so forth, but that's where I'm going to leave off with some thoughts about the life of John Wesley. Thank you.